The chamber fell silent. Then Tuberville laughed. It wasn't the kind of laugh that lightens a room or softens a tense exchange. It was sharp, dismissive, the sound of a man who thought mockery was power. Cameras caught the upward curl of his lip, the quick flash of teeth, the kind of smirk that told the world he didn't take Jasmine Crockett seriously. The laugh cut through the air, bouncing off marble walls, echoing in the minds of those who had gathered expecting a debate about policy, not dignity. It was the laugh of a senator who had worn football victories as armor and now carried that swagger into a chamber where respect should have been the uniform. Reporters shifted in their seats. Some whispered to each other, pens already scratching notes that would become tomorrow's headlines. Camera shutters clicked, freezing the instant Tuberville's smirk against Crockett's steady, unblinking gaze. She didn't flinch. She didn't fire back with the quick bite of anger he might have expected. Instead, she paused. Her eyes met his across the table, and in that pause, something larger than the moment seemed to hover between them. This wasn't just laughter aimed at a colleague. To the audience watching, it carried a heavier weight. The sound of a powerful man reducing a woman, a daughter of sacrifice, to the punchline of his arrogance. The silence that followed was suffocating. Viewers at home leaned in closer to their screens, sensing a storm brewing in Crockett's stillness. The staffers behind her stiffened, waiting. Even Tuberville, in the corner of his grin, seemed uncertain whether his laugh had landed as he'd intended. What he didn't know, what no one in that chamber yet knew, was that Jasmine Crockett hadn't walked into this room armed only with her wits. She carried something deeper, something forged decades earlier in the mud and blood of a distant jungle. While Tuberville laughed from a place of privilege, Crockett held in her hands a story written in sacrifice. A letter penned in the heat of war, carried across oceans, and preserved by memory and love. But what Crockett carried with her wasn't just words. It was her father's voice from a war fought half a century ago. Tommy Tuberville did not arrive in Washington through the trenches of policy or the study of law. He came as a coach, a man who had once barked orders on the sidelines of Saturday football, where victory was measured in touchdowns and applause. When Alabama sent him to the Senate, it wasn't because he had memorized the Constitution or studied the complexities of foreign policy. It was because he carried the persona of a winner, a man whose brand of plain talk seemed, for a time, to resonate with voters who believed swagger equaled strength. But swagger on the football field is not the same as wisdom in the Senate chamber. And as Tuberville took his seat among lawmakers, a pattern quickly emerged. Gaffes became his signature. Comments that blurred history, missteps that exposed shallow understanding, moments where arrogance filled the space where humility should have been. For some, these gaffes were amusing distractions. For others, they were alarming reminders of what happens when power is handed to those who confuse performance with governance. So when Tuberville laughed at Representative Jasmine Crockett, it wasn't just one man mocking one woman. It was the full weight of that history crashing into the present. A white, male senator elevated by privilege and persona, choosing to belittle a black congresswoman whose very presence in that chamber carried the story of struggle, perseverance, and sacrifice. The optics could not be ignored. His laugh did not just echo through the chamber. It echoed through the nation's ongoing reckoning with race, gender, and respect. And there was another layer, one that pierced deeper. Crockett was not simply a politician fielding insults in the arena of debate. She was the daughter of a man who had worn the uniform of the United States during one of its most brutal conflicts. Her father had carried the weight of war on his shoulders, endured the mud, the gunfire, the uncertainty of whether he would ever see home again. His sacrifice was stitched into her very identity. To mock her was, in a way, to mock that legacy, to belittle the price paid by those who served. This is why the moment mattered. Because in America, respect is not supposed to be transactional. It is not granted only to those who look like us, vote like us, or come from the same corners of privilege. Respect is owed to service, to dignity, to the belief that anyone who steps into the arena, whether the battlefield abroad or the chamber of Congress at home, deserves to be met with decency, not derision. Tuberville's laugh, then, became a symbol of something larger than himself. It became a test. Does America still honor dignity over arrogance? Does sacrifice still mean something, even when mocked by those too insulated to understand it? Or have we slipped into an age where smirks and soundbites carry more weight than the quiet endurance of those who gave everything? The room might not have realized it in that instant, but the clash unfolding between Tuberville and Crockett was not just about ego. It was about the story of America itself, who gets mocked, who gets respected, and who gets to define what patriotism looks like. And soon Tuberville would find out just how deep those values ran. Tommy Tuberville built his reputation not in the halls of governance, but under the bright lights of football stadiums. For years he strutted the sidelines, headset pressed to his ears, fists pumping in triumph, his identity welded to the roar of crowds and the worship of fans. Victory was the currency he understood. Swagger was the language he spoke. And when the final whistle blew, Tuberville learned that charisma could outshine substance, that performance could be mistaken for leadership. That same swagger carried him into the U.S. Senate, where his football pass became his only real credential. He arrived in Washington more like a celebrity guest than a statesman, a man who had been handed the microphone not because of policy expertise, but because voters found his bluntness refreshing. To some, he embodied the outsider spirit. To others, he was living proof of how low the bar had been set for those who wield power. From the start, his tenure was marked by controversy. He fumbled basic facts of government. He blurred history in ways that made headlines, confusing global alliances and stumbling over names of institutions he was supposed to defend. At times, his missteps seemed almost harmless, the kind of gaffes that late-night comedians live for. But beneath the humor lay something less funny, a dismissive tone that betrayed just how little respect he had for the seriousness of the office he held. Tuberville reveled in this persona. The same bravado that once motivated locker rooms became the armor he wore against critics. He leaned into the role of the blunt-talking maverick, unconcerned with nuance or respect. His supporters cheered the defiance. His detractors saw recklessness. But what united both sides was the sense that Tuberville cared more about the performance of politics than its practice. And then came the irony that would not be lost on anyone paying attention. A man who had never worn a uniform, never shouldered a rifle, never stared down an enemy on foreign soil, felt comfortable laughing at the daughter of a veteran. Tommy Tuberville, who had lived his adult life in the comforts of privilege and prestige, chose to dismiss a woman whose very identity was shaped by sacrifice he could scarcely imagine. The optics were damning. The arrogance, unmistakable. It wasn't the first time Tuberville had displayed a tone-deaf instinct. Time and again, he had brushed aside the lived experiences of others, flattening complex struggles into punchlines or careless remarks. For him, politics was a game to be won, opponents to be mocked, victories to be tallied. But in his pursuit of winning moments, he missed the quiet truth that not every arena can be coached, and not every opponent can be shouted down. Like many villains in history, Tuberville's flaw was not just arrogance, it was detachment. He lived in a world insulated from the grit of sacrifice, where privilege softened consequences and swagger could paper over ignorance. To him, Crockett's presence was not the story of generational service or the echo of a father's courage. It was merely another opponent across the table, someone to be laughed at in order to score a momentary advantage. But in that laugh, he revealed himself. He revealed a man unprepared for the weight of the chamber he occupied, a senator who mistook derision for dominance. He revealed the hollowness of swagger when set against the depth of lived conviction. And in doing so, he set the stage for his undoing. Because every villain, no matter how loud, eventually meets the one force they cannot silence: the quiet power of truth spoken with dignity. Tuberville did not know it yet, but the words that would shatter his arrogance had already been written. Not by Crockett, not by strategists, not by pundits. They had been written decades ago, in ink pressed onto paper by the hand of a soldier fighting far from home. But every villain's arrogance blinds them to the one thing they can't prepare for: truth spoken with lived conviction. Jasmine Crockett did not rise from the same world that produced Tommy Tuberville. She was not born into privilege, nor did she inherit a stage and a cheering crowd waiting to anoint her with victory. Her story began in the quiet strength of her family, anchored by a father who knew the meaning of sacrifice not from textbooks or campaign slogans, but from the harsh realities of war. Her father had been drafted to fight in Vietnam, a conflict that scarred a generation and divided a nation. He was young, barely into adulthood, when he was shipped across the ocean to fight a war he hadn't chosen. The jungles were thick, the nights long, the fear constant. Yet in letters home, he never let despair seep onto the page. He wrote with steadiness, with pride, with a deep belief that service, however thankless, was his duty. One of those letters, worn with age and folded 100 times, carried words that Jasmine would never forget. It was addressed not to her, but to her mother, written in hurried script during a rare moment of calm. In it he spoke of the heat, the chaos, and the uncertainty, but also of his longing to return home, to build a family, to teach his children the values that war had burned into his soul. Discipline, courage, and above all dignity. Jasmine grew up in the shadow of that sacrifice. Her father did not glorify his time in Vietnam, but he did not hide it either. He taught her that freedom had a cost, that service meant carrying responsibility, even when no one thanked you for it. He raised her to believe that dignity was non-negotiable, that no matter who tried to belittle her, she carried within her the blood of someone who had risked everything for the very flag others waved casually in their own defense. Her path was not easy. She faced the struggles that too often shadow young black women striving to carve out a place in America. Money was tight. Opportunity was not handed to her. She had to fight for every inch, every scholarship, every chance to prove that she belonged in rooms where too many assumed she did not. Yet with each obstacle, she drew from the lessons her father had instilled. Persistence in the face of arrogance, composure in the face of ridicule, resilience when the world whispered that she could not. Those values carried her into law. She chose not the lucrative path that could have padded her bank account, but the difficult path of public service. She stood for those who were voiceless, for communities forgotten, for individuals steamrolled by systems too big and too indifferent to care. Courtrooms became her battlefield, cross-examinations her combat. She fought with words instead of weapons, but the spirit was the same as her father's in Vietnam. Defend, endure, protect. From law she moved into politics, not out of vanity or ambition, but because she understood something essential, that real change required a seat at the table. And so she stepped into the arena, carrying not only her own story but the weight of every client she had defended, every neighbor she had represented, every lesson her father had passed down. To Jasmine Crockett, service was not a slogan. It was a lineage. Jasmine grew up in the shadow of that sacrifice. Her father did not glorify his time in Vietnam, but he did not hide it either. He taught her that freedom had a cost, that service meant carrying responsibility, even when no one thanked you for it. He raised her to believe that dignity was non-negotiable, that no matter who tried to belittle her, she carried within her the blood of someone who had risked everything for the very flag others waved casually in their own defense. Her path was not easy. She faced the struggles that too often shadow young black women striving to carve out a place in America. Money was tight. Opportunity was not handed to her. She had to fight for every inch, every scholarship, every chance to prove that she belonged in rooms where too many assumed she did not. Yet with each obstacle, she drew from the lessons her father had instilled. Persistence in the face of arrogance, composure in the face of ridicule, resilience when the world whispered that she could not. Those values carried her into law. She chose not the lucrative path that could have padded her bank account, but the difficult path of public service. She stood for those who were voiceless, for communities forgotten, for individuals steamrolled by systems too big and too indifferent to care. Courtrooms became her battlefield, cross-examinations her combat. She fought with words instead of weapons, but the spirit was the same as her father's in Vietnam. Defend, endure, protect. And it was that lineage that gave her a rare kind of composure. Where others might lash out at disrespect, she learned to pause, to let the weight of silence work in her favor. Where others might crumble under mockery, she knew that arrogance always reveals more about the mocker than the mocked. Her father had endured worse than laughter. He had faced bullets, landmines, and nights where survival was uncertain. Compared to that, a senator's chuckle was dust in the wind. Still, she carried his words with her, not just in memory but in physical form. That letter, the one written on crinkled paper decades earlier in the jungles of Vietnam, was a talisman. She had kept it preserved, sometimes folded into her purse, sometimes tucked into a desk drawer, but always within reach. When she doubted herself, she reread it. When she faced hostility, she reminded herself that her father had endured far worse. The ink may have faded, but the conviction never did. So when Tuberville laughed, Jasmine Crockett was not alone. She carried with her the weight of that folded paper, the ink-stained voice of a soldier who had fought for a country that often failed to fight for him. She carried her father's dignity into a room where arrogance thought it could reign unchecked, and on this day, in this room, that letter would speak louder than Tuberville's laughter ever could. The chamber returned to focus, but the air was heavier now, charged with the weight of what had just passed. Tuberville leaned back in his chair, that same grin plastered across his face, as though this were nothing more than another game day. Another chance to rattle the opponent and rile the crowd. He interrupted as Crockett spoke, his voice rising over hers with a tone that dripped with condescension. Every time she tried to thread her argument, his laughter sliced through like a heckler who mistook disruption for wit. "Here we go again," he muttered loudly enough for the microphones to catch, shaking his head as if her very words were a comedy routine. The chuckle came once more, this time slower, almost performative, a signal to his allies that he was in control, that her presence did not merit respect. For a moment Crockett simply absorbed it. She kept her composure, letting him expend his arrogance, letting the echoes of his mockery hang unchallenged in the air. Her stillness was its own kind of defiance, a refusal to meet disrespect with desperation. But the silence did not soften the sting, it sharpened it. Those watching felt the injustice growing heavier by the second. The optics of a white male senator mocking a black congresswoman were undeniable, and outrage began to swell. In the press gallery, reporters exchanged glances. Their pens raced, capturing the tension building like a storm at sea. On social media, where clips were already being clipped and shared, the refrain began. "How dare he?" Viewers didn't need a headline to tell them what they were witnessing. They could feel it in their bones. A line was being crossed, dignity trampled by arrogance. Tuberville pressed on, leaning forward now, his interruptions more aggressive. "That's cute, Representative," he said, chuckling, as if her arguments were beneath consideration. Each word struck like a slap meant not just for Crockett, but for anyone who had ever been dismissed, belittled, or laughed at for daring to speak truth in the face of power. Crockett, however, did not break. Her father's voice lingered within her like a compass, pointing her toward calm when fury threatened to take over. She looked at Tuberville not with anger, but with the patience of someone who had endured worse storms than this. She let him have his moment, his laughter, his interruptions, his smugness. She let him believe, for one brief spell, that arrogance had the upper hand, but beneath that calm, the storm was gathering. The audience could sense it, the stillness before thunder, the quiet before lightning strikes. The weight of history sat behind her eyes. The sacrifices of her father, the struggle of generations, the unshakable dignity of those who carried service in their blood. She was not just answering for herself anymore. She was answering for all of them. The chamber grew restless. Some staffers shifted uneasily. Even Tuberville's allies began to realize that something was changing in the room, though Tuberville himself seemed oblivious, lost in the illusion of his own dominance. He laughed again, a short, sharp bark that seemed to slice through Crockett's words mid-sentence. This time she paused. She looked down, steadying herself, then slowly reached for her papers. The room fell quieter still. Every eye turned toward her. The grin faded ever so slightly from Tuberville's face, as though some instinct deep inside warned him that the game was about to shift. The storm that had been brewing now reached its breaking point. Crockett's hand rested on the one thing she had carried with her not just to this hearing, but through her life, the folded letter worn by decades, written by her father in a war far from this chamber. Then, Crockett reached for something the room never expected. For a heartbeat, the chamber seemed suspended in stillness. The scrape of Crockett's chair, the shuffle of papers, even the hum of cameras, all faded into the background as she laid her hand on the envelope. Its edges were frayed, the fold lines softened from decades of careful keeping. She did not rush. She did not match Tuberville's laughter with fire. Instead, she lifted the letter with deliberate calm, a quiet act of defiance more powerful than any raised voice. Tuberville tilted his head, still wearing the half-smile of a man who believed he had already won the moment. He leaned back, arms folded, projecting indifference. To him it was a prop, a stunt, another attempt to reclaim dignity from his smirk. But as Crockett unfolded the fragile pages, something shifted. The chamber leaned in. Even the cameras seemed to zoom closer, their lenses hungry for the words written in another time. Her voice, steady and deliberate, cut through the air. My dearest love, today the rain hasn't stopped. The ground is mud, and I can't tell where the earth ends and my body begins. But I fight because I must. I fight because I want to come home to you, to a daughter I hope one day will know that her father gave everything for her freedom. The words were not crafted for politics. They were raw, intimate, written by a young soldier desperate to cling to something greater than fear. And as Crockett read, the weight of them filled the room. The smirk on Tuberville's face faltered, if only slightly. His eyes narrowed, no longer in mockery but in discomfort, as though the letter itself had reached across time to hold him accountable. Crockett continued. They tell us to be brave, but bravery isn't what you think. Bravery is walking forward when every instinct tells you to hide. Bravery is trusting that your sacrifice will mean something to a country that does not always see you. If I do not make it back, let our daughter know that she carries my blood, and with it, the strength to stand tall when others try to make her small. A hush spread. The reporters' pens slowed. Staffers straightened in their seats. Phones lit up in the gallery as words spilled instantly onto social media feeds. Hashtags emerged within seconds. Hashtag Vietnam letter. Hashtag Crockett silences Tuberville. Hashtag respect the sacrifice. Across the country, viewers watching live felt the shift in their gut, the pivot from politics to something sacred. Tuberville shifted uncomfortably now, no longer leaning back with confidence. The swagger drained as the chamber's attention abandoned him entirely. He had mocked, laughed, dismissed. But against these words, ink pressed onto paper by a young soldier drenched in rain and fear. His laughter seemed suddenly obscene. Crockett's voice tightened as she reached the heart of the letter. If I come home, I want our children to know dignity. I want them to know that no matter how the world treats them, they are never less than anyone else. And if I don't come home, let them know that their father stood in the mud for them, for a flag that did not always love him back, but that he still chose to serve. The silence was absolute now. Even Tuberville's allies, who had chuckled with him moments before, stared down at their desks. His grin was gone, replaced by the expression of a man realizing he had underestimated not just his opponent, but the gravity of what she carried. Then Crockett folded the letter gently, placing it on the table before her. She looked directly at Tuberville, her eyes steady, her voice sharp enough to cut through the marble around them. You laugh at me, Senator, she said, each word deliberate. But you will not laugh at the blood my father spilled for this flag. The chamber froze. Reporters' fingers hammered at keyboards. The gallery erupted in hushed murmurs, some audible gasps slipping through the quiet. On social media, the moment went viral in real time. Clips replayed, slowed down, captions emblazoned. Asterisk. You will not laugh at the blood my father spilled. Asterisk. Tuberville sat motionless, caught in a silence he could not break. His smirk was gone, his arrogance deflated. For perhaps the first time in his Senate career, words failed him. His eyes flickered, darting down at his notes, then back up as though searching for an escape. But there was none. The power had shifted. Crockett leaned back slightly, not in retreat but in triumph. She had not raised her voice. She had not matched his mockery. She had silenced him with something deeper. The truth of sacrifice, the dignity of service, the unshakable authority of lived experience. In living rooms across America, audiences erupted, cheering, clapping, even tearing up. Veterans saluted their screens. Families texted each other links to the clip. Commentators began preparing their monologues. This was not just another political exchange. This was a defining moment. The silence lingered in the chamber, heavy, unbroken. Tuberville's arrogance had met its reckoning in the quiet power of a father's words, carried across generations and spoken by the daughter who refused to be diminished. And in that silence, America heard more than just a debate, it heard a reckoning. The moment Jasmine Crockett folded her father's letter and delivered her line, the chamber may have fallen silent, but the rest of the country erupted. Within seconds, the clip was ripped from the live feed and plastered across timelines. On Twitter, hashtags surged into the top 10. Hashtag Vietnam letter. Hashtag Crockett mic drop. Hashtag respect the sacrifice. The words she spoke, asterisk, you will not laugh at the blood my father spilled for this flag, asterisk, became an instant rallying cry. Users pinned it to their profiles, edited it into banners, and shared it with captions that carried both anger and pride. TikTok lit up as well. Creators stitched the moment with somber piano tracks, slowing the footage as Crockett lifted the letter, highlighting Tuberville's smirk evaporating in real time. Veterans uploaded duets, saluting their screens as she read her father's words. Some held up their own letters from war, faded photographs tucked into helmets, folded notes written on foreign soil. "We've all got one," one veteran said, voice breaking. "And she just spoke for all of us." Instagram Reels and YouTube edits went further, layering Crockett's speech over montages of soldiers returning home, flag-draped coffins, and protest marches. For dignity, the narrative was no longer confined to one hearing. It was about history, about sacrifice, about the line between arrogance and respect. Celebrities added fuel to the fire. Actors, athletes, and musicians tweeted their support. A Grammy-winning singer posted, "This is how you shut down disrespect, with dignity and truth." A retired general wrote, "Tuberville laughed. Crockett reminded us what service really means." Even late-night hosts, normally armed with jokes, paused their comedy to play the clip uncut, letting the silence that followed her words speak louder than any punchline. For ordinary citizens, the moment struck a personal chord. Parents showed it to their kids as an example of how to respond to arrogance without losing composure. Teachers discussed it in classrooms, linking Crockett's father's letter to the lived experience of countless veterans who rarely get acknowledgement. One viral Facebook post from a Gold Star mother read simply, "She spoke for us." The media machine wasted no time framing the narrative. Headlines blared across major outlets. Crockett silences Tuberville with Vietnam letter. The day mockery met its match. The moment Tuberville was humbled. Political commentators filled cable segments with slow-motion replays, some marveling at her restraint, others noting the symbolic weight of a black congresswoman invoking the words of a veteran father against the dismissive laughter of a privileged senator. But it wasn't just admiration. The backlash against Tuberville grew just as quickly. Opinion pieces questioned his judgment, his insensitivity, his habit of dismissing those he disagreed with. Editorial cartoons sketched him shrinking in his chair as Crockett towered over him, letter in hand. Memes exploded. One showed Tuberville laughing in the first frame, then silenced in the next, captioned "game over." Another compared him to a heckler who gets destroyed by the headliner's final line. In living rooms, on buses, in coffee shops, the conversation shifted. People who had never watched a congressional hearing were suddenly talking about the dignity of service, about respect owed to veterans, about the arrogance of those who dismiss what they don't understand. Crockett's words became a cultural shorthand, proof that quiet conviction could dismantle bluster. For Tuberville, the silence that had trapped him in that chamber followed him far beyond its walls. His team scrambled to issue statements, attempting to spin the exchange as spirited debate. But no statement could erase the footage. No press release could compete with the raw authenticity of a daughter reading her father's letter in front of the nation. This was more than a viral moment. It was a rupture. It revealed the fault line between mockery and meaning, between privilege and sacrifice. It showed, in stark contrast, the emptiness of arrogance against the unshakable weight of dignity. And while social media surged with clips, hashtags, and commentary, the deeper question lingered just beneath the surface. Because beyond the memes, beyond the trending topics, beyond the temporary firestorm of outrage and admiration, something larger was stirring. But beyond the viral moment lay a deeper truth about who we are as a nation. As the dust settled from the viral storm, Jasmine Crockett did something remarkable. She did not linger on Tuberville's smirk, nor did she allow herself to bask in the spotlight of a trending clip. Instead, she returned to the heart of the matter, the values her father had lived by and the lesson he had handed down to her in that worn Vietnam letter. "Mockery is fleeting," she reminded the room, her voice steady. "But dignity is eternal." It was more than a rebuke of one senator's laugh. It was a declaration of what truly endures when arrogance collides with sacrifice. A laugh lasts a moment. Service lasts a lifetime. And it was that lifetime of service, of her father and countless others, that deserved the room's reverence. She tied his story to a broader American tapestry. Her father's journey, drafted into a war half a world away, was not an isolated sacrifice. It was a reflection of millions of families, immigrants who carried flags draped over caskets, children who grew up with empty chairs at dinner tables, spouses who bore the weight of both hope and loss. Crockett framed her father's service as part of a shared lineage, an inheritance of dignity that binds the nation across races, classes, and generations. She spoke of how America's strength is measured not in how loudly its leaders laugh, but in how faithfully its people serve. From the immigrant who swears an oath to a new homeland, to the farm worker who sends their child to college, to the soldier who never makes it home, each act of commitment is a strand in the fabric of what it means to be American. The chamber listened. The nation listened. And for a rare moment, the partisan theater faded into something larger. Crockett's words echoed as both rebuke and reminder that arrogance will always try to drown out sacrifice, but sacrifice speaks in tones that cannot be silenced. She lifted the moral higher still. We can't choose whether others laugh at us, she said, but we can choose whether we stand with dignity. My father chose service. I choose service. And I hope every American remembers that when mockery fades, it is resilience, not ridicule, that defines us. It was the kind of moment that drew people together. Veterans across the country felt their sacrifices honored. Immigrant families heard their own struggles validated. Young Americans, scrolling through their feeds, found an image of leadership that was less about winning an argument and more about embodying values larger than oneself. Her father's letter was not just a relic of war. It became a living testament, repurposed in that hearing to remind the nation of who it still could be. Through Crockett's voice, the ink on that page reached across decades to insist that respect and justice remain at the center of American identity. The lesson was unmistakable. Power can sneer. Arrogance can chuckle. But neither has the strength to outlast the quiet dignity of sacrifice. And in that realization, Crockett turned what could have been another forgettable spat in Congress into a parable about America itself. A nation too often divided, yet always capable of finding unity in shared sacrifice. She closed her remarks not with anger, but with a kind of hope. Hope that America might remember who built it, who fought for it, who bled for it. Hope that dignity would triumph over derision, not just in one chamber, but in every community across the land. Justice, resilience, Americanness, these were the values she left hanging in the air. Not Tuberville's laughter, not the fleeting arrogance of a smirk, but the timeless echo of a father's service, passed down to a daughter who carried it with honor. And as she gathered her papers, one truth lingered for all who heard it. America had been reminded once again that its truest strength lies not in mockery, but in the courage of those who serve. In the end, it was a contrast too sharp to ignore. On one side, Tommy Tuberville's laugh, casual, dismissive, a sound that carried the weight of arrogance more than wit. On the other, Jasmine Crockett's voice, steady, rooted in the words of her father's Vietnam letter, carrying the gravity of service and sacrifice. That laugh may have sparked the moment, but it was the letter that defined it. This was never just about a senator's smirk or a congresswoman's patience. It was about the line between ridicule and respect, about whether America still honors the people who gave everything so others could stand free. Tuberville mocked, but Crockett reminded us. Service deserves reverence, not derision. That is the moral clarity the nation felt in that chamber. A fleeting laugh cannot erase decades of sacrifice. A smirk cannot overshadow the ink of a soldier's words written from a battlefield. And arrogance will always crumble in the presence of dignity. If you believe that dignity should always outshine arrogance, if you believe that the sacrifices of veterans, immigrants, and families deserve respect, not ridicule, then let this story live beyond a single headline. Share it, carry it, keep it alive. Subscribe to this channel because these voices, voices of resilience, voices of truth, voices of service, must never be silenced. Together we can make sure that every sneer is answered with strength, every insult with inspiration, and every act of mockery with a reminder that America is built not on arrogance, but on sacrifice. Tuberville may have laughed, but Crockett's father's letter? It will echo far longer. And it is in that echo that we find our truest American story.